Racist professor, fails a student on purpose, regrets it when she becomes his boss years later. Professor Richard Coleman smirked as he slid a failed exam paper across the desk. "I'm sorry, Maya, but you just don't have what it takes," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Maya Williams stared at the paper in disbelief. She had studied harder than anyone, poured her heart into her work. But she knew the truth. This wasn't about her performance. This was about who she was. A black woman who dared to dream of success in a field where people like her were never welcomed. She clenched her fists. "This isn't fair." Coleman leaned back, chuckling. "Life isn't fair. Some people just aren't meant for leadership." Maya's stomach twisted. But years later, the tables would turn in a way he never saw coming. Because one day, he would walk into an office, expecting to impress his new boss, only to realize that boss was Maya. The prestigious university classroom was silent, except for the sound of papers being shuffled and graded exams being returned. Professor Richard Coleman moved slowly, pausing at each desk, handing back test papers with cold efficiency. Maya Williams sat near the front, her fingers tapping nervously against her desk. She had worked day and night for this moment. She had studied harder than anyone in the class. And yet, when the professor reached her desk, his smirk widened. He slid the paper toward her. A bold red F was marked across the top. Maya's heart sank. Maya Williams was a young black woman in her early 20s, sharp, ambitious, and determined. She wasn't just a student, she was a fighter. She had spent years proving people wrong, working twice as hard for half the recognition. And this class? It was supposed to be her stepping stone to success. She dreamed of being a business leader, running companies, making an impact. But people like Professor Coleman never made it easy. Richard Coleman was a seasoned professor in his late 50s. To most, he was respected. To Maya, he was a gatekeeper, a man who had spent years deciding who deserved success. And in his mind, Maya didn't belong. The classroom was bright, modern, filled with eager students. But Maya felt completely alone. She looked around, hoping to find some kind of support. A few students glanced her way, their faces full of sympathy. But no one spoke up. Because everyone knew. Coleman was untouchable. He had failed students before, students who looked like her, and he had gotten away with it every time. Maya swallowed, forcing herself to speak. "Professor, this isn't right. I worked hard. I know my answers were correct." Coleman leaned forward, resting his arms on her desk. His voice was mockingly soft. And yet, here we are. Maya's fingers curled into fists. She had fought too hard to be dismissed like this. But when she glanced toward the administration office across the hall, she already knew what they would say. "Professor Coleman is an esteemed member of our faculty. Perhaps you just need to work harder next time. It's best to focus on improving rather than blaming others." They wouldn't listen. They never did. Coleman chuckled, sensing her frustration. "I'll give you some advice, Maya." He smirked. "Maybe you should lower your expectations. Leadership isn't for everyone." His voice dripped with arrogance. Maya stared at him, memorizing his face. One day, she vowed, he would regret this moment. One day, he would learn who truly belonged. And when that day came, she would be the one in power. Maya sat in stunned silence, staring at the red F on her paper. Her mind raced. How had she failed? She had spent countless nights studying, perfecting every answer, ensuring her work was flawless. Yet here she was, failing, not because of her work, but because of the man standing before her. Professor Coleman leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. He wasn't even trying to hide his satisfaction. "What's the matter, Maya?" he said smoothly. "Disappointed? You shouldn't be. Business is tough. Not everyone makes it." His voice was mocking, dripping with superiority. Maya's fists clenched under the desk. She had seen this before, not just with herself, but with other students who looked like her. Black students. Students who worked twice as hard, only to be told they weren't good enough. Maya took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. She refused to let him see her break. "Professor," she said, keeping her voice steady, "I'd like to go over my answers with you. I know my work was strong." Coleman's smirk widened. "Oh, Maya." He chuckled, shaking his head. "I admire your confidence, but I'm afraid my decision is final." Her chest tightened. He wasn't even willing to review her work. This wasn't just about a grade. This was about control, about keeping people like her in their place. Maya's eyes flicked around the classroom. Other students were watching. Some of them looked guilty, shifting uncomfortably. A few had seen this before, but no one spoke up. Because they knew better. Professor Coleman was untouchable. He had been teaching at the university for over 20 years. Respected, powerful, connected, and students who challenged him. They didn't win. Maya swallowed her frustration. "I'll take this to the administration." Coleman's smirk turned into a full laugh. "Oh, by all means. Go ahead," he said, gesturing toward the door. "But let me save you some time." He leaned forward, his eyes cold. "No one will listen." Maya's breath caught in her throat, because deep down, she knew he was right. The university had always protected men like Coleman. She had seen it before. Complaints dismissed, students rushed off, misunderstandings smoothed over. And now, she was just another name on a long list of students who had been failed, not because of their abilities, but because someone decided they didn't belong. Maya's heart pounded. She had worked too hard to let him take this from her. She refused to let this define her. This wasn't the end. She pushed back her chair, standing tall. Coleman arched an eyebrow, amused. "Going so soon?" Maya met his gaze. "I'll see you again, Professor." His smile flickered. Something about the way she said it, calm, certain, unsettled him. Maya turned and walked out of the classroom, her head held high. She didn't know how, she didn't know when, but one day she would make him regret this moment, and she would make sure he remembered her name. 10 years later, the grand glass skyscraper stood tall in the heart of the city, a symbol of power, progress, and leadership. Inside the top floor, the executive boardroom was filled with some of the most influential business leaders in the industry. Among them sat Professor Richard Coleman. But today, he wasn't a professor anymore. After retiring from teaching, he had become a business consultant, hoping to use his experience to guide major corporations. And today, he had been invited for an important meeting. A new CEO had taken over the company, a powerful, respected leader, and Coleman was here to impress them. He smoothed his tie, already preparing his introduction. He had built a lifetime of influence. He knew how to command respect. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for what happened next. The boardroom doors opened. Everyone stood as the CEO walked in. And Coleman felt the blood drain from his face, because standing at the head of the table was Maya Williams. Maya was different now. She walked with confidence, grace, and authority. Her tailored suit was elegant, her posture powerful. The woman he had once mocked and dismissed was now the most important person in the room. And he was just another consultant hoping to impress her. Coleman's mouth went dry. He tried to mask his shock, but Maya had already seen it. And for a brief moment, she let him sit in it. The weight of the realization, the undeniable truth. The student he had failed on purpose was now his boss. Maya's voice was calm, composed. "Good afternoon, everyone." Her eyes flicked to Coleman for half a second. Then she moved on. Like he was nothing, Coleman shifted in his seat. For the first time in years, he felt small. The meeting began, with Maya leading the discussion. She spoke with precision and expertise, commanding the room effortlessly. Coleman, still unsettled, tried to focus, but the power shift was undeniable. Then Maya turned her gaze directly to him. "Professor Coleman." He stiffened at the way she said it. Not Mr. Coleman, not Dr. Coleman. Professor, a deliberate reminder. Coleman forced a smile. "Yes, ma'am?" Maya tilted her head slightly. "You're here today to advise on leadership strategies, correct?" He nodded quickly. "Yes, that's right." Maya leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "Tell me, Professor." A pause. "What makes a great leader?" Coleman swallowed, because he knew. This wasn't just a question. This was a test. And Maya? She was the one grading him now. Coleman cleared his throat. "Well, a great leader." He hesitated. Then finally he spoke. "Knows how to recognize potential." Maya didn't blink. "Interesting." She tapped her fingers on the table. "And would you say a great leader treats all people fairly?" Coleman's jaw tightened. "Of course." Maya smiled. But it wasn't friendly. It was knowing. "Good." She leaned back. "Because I believe every professional deserves a fair chance to succeed." The weight of her words hit like a hammer. And Coleman, he couldn't breathe. The room was silent, everyone watching the unspoken exchange. Coleman's hands clenched under the table. The man who had once laughed in her face now sat, powerless. He wanted to speak, to apologize. But he knew no words would fix what he had done. Because Maya, she had already won. And the worst part? She didn't need revenge. She had succeeded without his approval. And now, she had the power to decide his future. Maya flipped through her notes. Then, she set them aside. "Thank you for your insights, Professor Coleman. We'll be in touch." That was it. No second chances, no guarantees, just 4 simple words. "We'll be in touch." Coleman's stomach dropped, because he knew that was the end. As the meeting ended, everyone stood and began gathering their things. Coleman sat frozen. Maya gave him one last look. Not of anger, not of hatred, just certainty. She had won, and she had done it without becoming like him. Coleman finally looked down, because now he understood, and for the first time in his life, he regretted everything. The meeting was over, but Professor Coleman remained seated. He watched as the board members and executives exchanged pleasantries, shaking hands with Maya. They respected her, admired her. And why wouldn't they? She had proven herself. She had built a career that he once told her was impossible, and now he was the one waiting for approval. As the last of the executives left, only 2 people remained in the boardroom, Maya and him. For the first time, Coleman felt truly alone. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to speak. "Maya." She turned slowly, arms crossed. "Professor." The word hit him like a reminder of who he used to be. The man who once held her future in his hands. Now, he was just a consultant hoping for a job. And Maya was the one who could decide his future. Coleman shifted in his seat, suddenly finding it hard to meet her gaze. "Listen, about the past," he exhaled. "I know I wasn't fair to you." Maya tilted her head. "Fair?" The word hung in the air. Coleman hesitated, choosing his next words carefully. "I was wrong." His voice was low, almost ashamed. Maya didn't blink. "Wrong about what?" Coleman's face tightened. "About you, about your potential." He swallowed. "I see that now." Maya studied him for a long moment. Then she let out a soft laugh, not out of amusement. but because she had already known this for years. Maya took a step closer, looking him straight in the eyes. "I want to be clear, Professor." Coleman flinched at how sharp her voice had become. "You didn't just misjudge me. You failed me, on purpose." Coleman opened his mouth, but Maya didn't let him speak. "You wanted me to believe I wasn't good enough, that no matter how hard I worked, I would never belong in leadership." Her words were a mirror, forcing him to see himself for who he really was. Coleman's shoulders slumped, because for the first time in his life, he had no defense. Maya took a deep breath and picked up a file from the table. She flipped it open, looking over the details of his consulting proposal. Then, without hesitation, she closed it. "I don't believe in revenge, Professor Coleman." Coleman's breath hitched. Was she about to give him another chance? Maya's gaze hardened. "But I do believe in accountability." She slid the file across the table. "So, here's your choice." Coleman hesitated before picking up the file. When he opened it, his face paled. Inside was a letter, a formal statement. It was a public acknowledgement of his past discrimination against students, an apology for the careers he had hindered, and a pledge to mentor young leaders moving forward. His hands trembled. Maya's voice was calm. "Sign it, and I'll consider your consulting offer. Walk away, and you'll never work in this industry again." Coleman's chest tightened. This was humiliating, but it was also his only option. He had once told Maya that some people weren't meant for leadership. Now, he had to prove he could be worthy of working under hers. Coleman exhaled shakily. Then, with a shaking hand, he picked up the pen and signed. Maya took the paper and read over his signature. She nodded. "Good. Now, we can talk about whether or not I actually need your services." Coleman swallowed hard, because even after signing, there was no guarantee she'd keep him. And that was the real lesson. Maya walked toward the door, pausing before leaving. "Have a good evening, Professor." This time, there was no mockery in her voice, no bitterness, just certainty, because the truth was simple. She had already won, and he knew it. Coleman sat frozen in the silent boardroom. His fingers rested on the signed confession, but his mind was elsewhere. For the first time in his life, he had no control, no power, no authority. And the woman he had once failed on purpose was now the one deciding his future. As Maya walked out of the boardroom, she passed by her assistant, who handed her another file. Inside were the names of students who had filed complaints against Coleman over the years. Students who had been dismissed, ignored, and told they were imagining things. Maya exhaled. She hadn't just been one case. She had been part of a pattern. And Coleman? He had thrived on it until today. Now he would be forced to acknowledge the damage he had done. And while he could never take back the years he had stolen from his students, he could at least face the truth. Hours later, Maya sat in her office, reviewing reports. Then, a knock at the door. She looked up. "Come in." Coleman stepped inside. But he wasn't the same man she'd met that morning. He looked smaller, humbled, defeated. Maya gestured toward the chair. "Take a seat." He hesitated before sitting down. Then, after a long pause, he finally spoke. "I owe you an apology, Maya." Maya folded her arms. "For what?" Coleman swallowed. It was the first time he had ever had to say these words. "For what I did to you, and to others like you." Maya didn't react. She let him sit in the discomfort. "I held you back on purpose," he admitted. "I failed you, not because you weren't smart enough, but because I didn't want to see you succeed." He exhaled sharply, as if the words themselves had burned his throat. "And I was wrong." Maya studied him. This was the first time she had ever seen genuine regret in his eyes. But regret alone wasn't enough. "I'm not looking for an apology, Professor." Her voice was calm. "I wanted you to understand something." She leaned forward. Leadership isn't about power. It's about responsibility. Coleman nodded slowly. For decades, he had believed that leaders chose who was worthy, that they had the power to control people's futures. But Maya had proven him wrong. She hadn't fought for revenge. She had fought for fairness. And in doing so, she had become everything he told her she could never be. Maya exhaled and pushed the signed document toward him. "You have two choices, Coleman." He looked up, surprised. "You can leave here and disappear, never facing the students you wronged." She tilted her head. "Or you can do something with this regret." He frowned. "What do you mean?" Maya tapped the file. "You're going to use your experience to mentor young professionals. And you're going to make sure that what happened to me never happens to anyone else." Coleman froze. This wasn't punishment, this was a second chance. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't going to waste it. Maya watched as he processed her words. Then slowly, he nodded. "I want to do better." His voice was quiet, but honest. Maya gave a small, satisfied nod. "Then start now." With that, the conversation was over. Coleman left the office, carrying the weight of his past and a chance to change his future. Maya leaned back in her chair, staring out of her window. The city stretched before her, full of opportunities. She had fought for every single one of them. And she had won, not because someone like Coleman allowed her to, but because she had never stopped believing in herself. Professor Richard Coleman once believed he had the power to decide who succeeded and who failed. He thought he could bury Maya Williams' potential. But Maya, she refused to be buried. She rose above his prejudice. She built her own success. And in the end, she proved that true power doesn't come from holding others back. It comes from lifting yourself up. And the best part? She didn't need revenge. She won by becoming everything he said she could never be. So, now, let's ask you, have you ever faced unfair treatment? How did you handle it? What would you have done in Maya's place? Let us know in the comments. And if this story inspired you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. For more powerful, eye-opening stories like this, hit that subscribe button now. Thank you for watching. And remember, success is the best response to injustice. Until next time.